So give a little intro. So thank you all for coming for the seminar today. I don't think Steph really needs an intro for any of you people, but it's Stefan Williams, professor here at the ACFR, University of Sydney. He leads the marine robotics research group within the ACFR. He's also head of the University of Sydney's Digital Sciences Institute and co-director of the New South Wales Space Research Network. He was the head of School of Aerospace, Mechanical, and Mechatronics Engineering from 2016 to 2021, and he is an ARC Future Fellow. He has done research over the past 2 decades focused on marine robotic systems. He's led Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System, autonomous underwater vehicle facility, and he's introduced many new fundamental insights to the field of marine robotics. So let's all welcome Stefan Williams. Thank you. So just for the audio, is it? It's just so I can wonder how you want. All right, great. Thanks for coming along. So as Gideon said, I've been doing marine robotics stuff for a long time, and I think this is going to be a bit of a smattering of things, both some historical stuff, but also a couple of things that have just happened in the last few weeks. And I'm going to try and tie it all together as a bit of a story about the research that I've been leading over the last couple of decades, really. And really, I think what we're trying to do is deploy robotic systems in challenging underwater environments. And I found this this picture from the US Geological Survey when I was preparing a talk last year. And so this talk is based on that talk. But I thought it captured a lot of kind of interesting things in places that we've actually worked. So this is kind of a representation of all the areas that people do research in the oceans. And ocean research is conducted in coastal zones, on the continental shelf, in canyons and continental slopes, and then down into deep water where there's really fundamental insights into geological processes that are shaping the world. And we've kind of worked in all of these places. And so I'm going to kind of frame the talk around the sorts of things that we've done in some of these different areas, and then show how we've contributed to science and understanding of these marine environments. So our work really over the past couple of decades has focused on developing new platforms and sensors. So you see vehicles that we've designed and built and deployed. We've integrated visual, acoustic, hyperspectral, light field imaging systems onto these platforms to try and understand how sensors operate in these marine environments. Done a lot of work, fundamental work in simultaneous localization and mapping. 20+ years ago, I guess my PhD was on SLAM and continues to kind of be a core part of what we do. We've looked at both visual and acoustic data. We do a lot of work on visualization. So how can we really help people understand these marine environments? There's been a lot of work, and I'll show some examples of that on planning and control. So how do we use information collected by vehicles and other data sources to help us plan deployments of these sorts of platforms? And then a lot of the research is really focused lately on the data analytics. So we have vehicles that can collect all kinds of information. How do we turn that into insights for the stakeholders that we're working with? And that's been a big part of the research that our group has done over the past couple of decades. And I think we've had a big focus on application. So really supporting research, not only in fundamental engineering science, but also working closely with ecologists, archaeologists, deep sea geoscience, and also looking at defense applications for this kind of technology. And I'll show some examples of all of these areas through the course of this talk. And we've worked with a large group of, is it on mute?
Shouldn't be.
That's a no.
No.
So, okay. And we work with a broad range of collaborators, both here in Australia and overseas. A big part of our funding for probably about 15 years came through something called the Integrated Marine Observing System. So back in 2007, the government set up what's called the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Program, where they were investing in key infrastructure to support science around Australia. So astronomers get telescopes, physicists get synchrotrons, and the marine science community came together and said, okay, what do we want in terms of infrastructure to help support marine science research? And we designed what's called the Integrated Marine Observing System. It's a series of moorings, floats, gliders, the instrument animals to collect data, the instrument ships. There's a lot of remote sensing that's used in marine science, and we set up an autonomous underwater vehicle facility. So I went along to the first NCRIS meeting about IMOS, and I said, "Oh, we've got an AUV. You know, how would you like to use that?" And kind of went, "Well, yeah, that sounds good." So we got a little bit of funding to do some pilot deployments, and then we spent the next 15 years essentially working all around Australia, deploying AUV systems, collecting data to help scientists understand key ecological features around the country. So we were working from the tropical north all the way down into temperate areas. This is probably, you know, the sizes didn't quite keep up with the actual data collected, but I'll show where we've got all this data now. And you can see we were really focused on repeat surveying, understanding how these kind of environments change through time, and I'll show some examples of that a little bit later in the talk. But we didn't just work in Australia. We also got invited to do a lot of work on the basis of the work that we've done. A lot of the work in Australia has been focused on ecology. I think I need an extra dot somewhere out here. We were at Norfolk Island a couple of weeks ago, so this does need to be updated. But we've worked in Tonga, Hawaii, done some work both in reef environments around Okinawa and Fukushima, in some deep water survey sites. Done a lot of work in archaeology in the Mediterranean and a little bit in the Caribbean. So you see, we've managed to connect with international communities doing research in marine sciences, and that's involved both our own vehicles, but also developing sensor payloads that we then put on other people's vehicles. So there's an imaging system here that was deployed with one of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, AUVs, manned submersible, and ROV. This is in Okinawa. And so we managed to bring a lot of collaborators to work on understanding these marine environments. And so I'll talk now a little bit about sort of some of these different areas. So a lot of our focus has been on coastal environments, areas that are difficult to access with people. So divers are significant risk when they go below 5 or 10 meters. There are also various bitey things that make any people in the oceans challenging. So, we've had a big focus on collecting information on reef environments. And this is kind of what the AUVs look like when they're underway. This is, in fact, one of the first AUVs that we really operated, and that was the workhorse of the IMOS program for about 10 years. It was built at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, but we equipped it with new camera systems, imaging payloads, and did a lot of work on the navigation and control systems. You can see the vehicle operating over very complex terrain. It's got an altimeter and a DVL. You can see the strobes here. And in fact, this is work that we did at the island of Antikythera in Greece, and I'll show an example of that with a later talk. So the vehicles are operating very close to the seafloor to get good, high quality imagery. A lot of AUVs typically fly very high off the deck. They're collecting acoustic data, but if you want optical data, you want to be close to the seafloor. So having this kind of maneuverability has been a pretty key feature of a lot of the platforms that we've worked with. And one of the things that we thought about is not just how do we deploy one vehicle, but how do we start working, do this force multiplication? How do we actually support work where we're deploying multiple platforms simultaneously? So we had some funding through the Schmidt Ocean Institute, which was founded by Eric Schmidt, the first CEO of Google. I think a lot of these tech kind of entrepreneurs tend to either put their money into space ventures or deep sea. Eric Schmidt and his wife set up this Schmidt Ocean Institute. They established a big oceanographic research festival, which was made available to the community. So we've invited a bunch of our colleagues from Woods Hole, MIT, Rhode Island, and the University of Michigan to come together. And in fact, Gideon, who's sitting in the front seat here, and is a postdoc now at ACFR. I think we first met on Schmidt Ocean Institute ship doing on this particular trip. So we had a couple of AUVs, we had an imaging float, a couple of other gliders. There was a surface vessel we were kind of experimenting with. And one of the big things that we were trying to do was to coordinate the deployment of multiple platforms simultaneously. So we drop off a glider, we then move the ship, we put an AUV in, kind of move around. We think about how we can use all of these assets and not kind of get stuck with a vehicle surfacing over there when we're focused on something else. So it was a lot of thinking about the logistics of these sort of things, but there was still a huge contingent of people required to operate all these vehicles. So we had the ship's crew, but then we also had each vehicle had a team of somewhere between 2 and I think 5. So we were kind of 50 people on this ship living on board this vessel for about 3 weeks. We also had all kinds of logistical issues with shipping batteries around. So there's a lot of logistics and things that go into mounting a campaign like this. But in the end, we were able to deploy platforms and collect information around a couple of Hawaiian islands. Great trip to be on, and we did some interesting things. One of the things that we do with a lot of this work is really look at the relationships between the habitats that we're surveying and the underlying bathymetry. So the structure of the seafloor, and in fact, this is Jackson's work that he did in his PhD. And essentially what we're doing here is building a completely unsupervised model that relates the imagery collected by the vehicle to the features of the underlying bathymetry. So we're using, in this case, an autoencoder to learn a latent space, so a feature space that allows us to compactly describe the structure of the seafloor. We then do a clustering of the imagery. We learn some habitat models, and then we train this Bayesian neural network to learn the relationship between that bathymetric latent space and the labels that we're pulling out of the imagery. So what does that look like? We ask the computer to kind of group similar images. They kind of look like this. We then get an ecologist to go in and provide us with some labels. So the computer doesn't know what's in any of these labels or any of these images. But what we do find is that we get very structured groups. So there's a lot of spatial correlation in the groups that are coming out of this process, which suggests that it's finding like similar looking images. And here we've labeled each image that's been collected by the vehicle according to one of these groups. We can then build a model that allows us to extrapolate where we'd expect to see these habitats in the environment based on the relationship between the structure in the places we do have imagery and the structure of the sort of broader environment. And you can see that we're predicting that it's going to be mostly sand out in the steep, flat areas. It'll be kind of reef, this kind of patchy reef or reef up in the slope. And on the peaks of these reefs, we're seeing a prediction that we'll see kelp. That's correlated very strongly with sort of the ecological insights of where kelp things that grow. They need a certain amount of light. So this makes a lot of sense when we show this to biologists. We also looked at some of the uncertainty that's associated with those allocations. Now, in some areas, we're not really sure if it's sand or this kind of screw shell rubble, I think was the red. So there's uncertainty because we can't tell the difference in the bathymetry. But there's also uncertainty in the model itself, which is this epistemic uncertainty. And that allows us to say, well, we're really not sure what's in this area. And so the objective of this work was to really decide or to determine where we should collect more data to improve the model quality. Now, some of that uncertainty we can't resolve because from the bathymetry, we can't tell if it's red or orange. But some of these areas we can say, well, actually, we don't have enough information. We should go get more data from those sites. So we took this concept and we actually, we've been thinking about AUVs, which are expensive. We did some thinking here about, well, if I want to get rid of all the really expensive sensors that are on this platform and move towards something much simpler. And this was inspired by Chris Roman's work at the University of Rhode Island. He was in Hawaii with us and had this imaging float that it had one axis of control. It would go down and it would float along in the currents, taking pictures, and then it would come back up and we'd collect it. And these you can make really cheap. And so we did a little bit of work. Here's Chris's float in Hawaii. Here's the SIRIS AV. Whenever you put two robots in a big ocean, they will inevitably immediately try to collide. So this is kind of a lucky image where we had a GoPro strapped onto the float. We could see on our tracking that, you know, the glider, the float was drifting along and the AUV was making a beeline for the float. So we acoustically then reprogrammed the float to pop up. And as you can see in that video, the AUV went directly underneath it. So it's a big place, but everything seemed to converge. We had a couple of incidents where things kind of got a little closer to each other than we liked. And so we were doing simultaneous deployments of these floats and AUVs and looking at registering some of the data from the two systems. We then did a little bit of work. We developed these floats. And again, this is Jackson who was very involved in this work. We took an unmanned surface vessel. We put an arm on the USV so that it could actually deploy and recover these floats. We put these into Sydney Harbor in, I think this is in Chowder Bay. And, you know, there's a lot of junk on the seafloor, not the prettiest bit of seafloor. We then took it up to a site offshore of Newcastle, much prettier environment. You can see this is kind of a fisheye lens. You got lots of fish and coral and interesting things like that. And so we did some trials through this project. This was again funded through the Schmidt Ocean Institute. They were interested in this concept of having multiple platforms simultaneously. So here you can see this is offshore of Cronulla, I think, or Port Hacking. So here you can see this arm going in, recovering the float. There it's being deployed and operating offshore with this system. And so what we did is we took this probabilistic planning technique that Jackson had developed. We had underlying bathymetry. We had some imagery that we were able to collect from that seafloor. And in fact, we had deployed one of our AUVs over this site. So we did this clustering, found that there was essentially sand, reef, and kelp in this little bit of seafloor. And the objective here was to try and close the loop using the floats to collect more information from this site. We wanted to do this in an iterative fashion to kind of prove that, you know, if we decided where we should put the floats, we'd get improvements in the model fidelity. So here's our habitat prediction after the first cycle of data. And I think this is from the AUV data. So you can see there's a lot of uncertainty kind of in this region of the environment because we haven't essentially taken any observations there. We then deployed the floats, recomputed our estimate of the distributions, and you can see there's been a pretty significant change here in what we think, you know, where the sand boundary is, and we've driven down the uncertainty. And then after the third set of observations, we end up with quite low uncertainty throughout the environment. So we're actually using that notion of uncertainty to drive where we do the sampling. And essentially what this looked like was our first deployment was the AUV. Then we put in a couple of floats into that kind of region up to the north. Then, you know, so we were able to do this kind of iterative process of collect data, build a model, decide where to put the next observations, and then iterate around. So using the data that we're collecting to really drive the deployments of the platform. Another interesting project, and this is another one of these tech moguls who's put money into ocean science. So the Inkfish Foundation has been established, which who's the founder? Okay.
It's better saying.
Okay, so Steam?
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, one of these guys who built tech, made a lot of money, decided to put money in, you know, some of that into ocean research. This was a collaboration, and it's ongoing with NTNU in Norway and the California Academy of Science. And the idea here is to really study mesophotic reef. So areas of reef environment that are kind of below typical diver depths, down to sort of order 150 meters. They were using divers in the shallow waters and some drifting floats, but also getting divers on rebreathers, baited underwater video systems, and then ROVs and AUVs to help study these kind of relatively poorly studied oceanographic environments. And so we were invited to be part of this project on the basis of the work we've done in developing a small, lightweight, autonomous underwater vehicle. We call this Seeker. It's designed to be highly maneuverable, so it's got tunnel thrusters, which allow us to kind of get into very tight spots, allow us to fly very close to the sea floor. This is some imagery from an inkfish trip to Tonga last October. But we've had a huge amount of interest in this platform. We've now built 4 of them. We've got a 5th one underway. So we're really starting to think about the commercial potential of this sort of technology. One of the first deployments we did with the Seeker was with support from Inkfish. They funded us to build 2 of these vehicles. So there was some work done in the north of the Tongan island chain. And the objective here was really to have divers going in on rebreathers, collecting actual samples. So if you watch this guy, you can see he's got a little array of vials. He's taking individual samples, putting them into these vials for further genomic analysis and things like that. And then having the AUV essentially mapping the whole site. So getting a big landscape scale model of that environment with which you can then situate where the divers are doing their kind of detailed studies. And I think at the beginning of this trip, the divers were a little skeptical of having the AUVs operating around, and there's sort of a process of, oh, well, we'll get the AUV in and then we'll get the diver. By the end, the divers were actually following the AUVs to site because they were so confident that we were kind of able to get the AUVs into the study location. So here they were looking for bits of the seafloor with a particular characteristic bottom profile. So they wanted to be able to get the divers going down to about 80 meters, 70 or 80 meters of water depth, and then slowly working up the slope. Just you have to manage your kind of airway carefully, or your dive carefully. So they were looking for areas that were relatively steep, but we also didn't want the AUV operating on kind of cliffs. So there was some tools built to automatically find potential dive sites and then to design vehicle surveys around those. So we're able to do that in an automated way, really operating AUVs on pretty complex topography. So these are this is kind of volcanic atolls, which are covered in coral reefs. The image that we collected with the vehicle looks a little bit like this. So these are kind of 8 megapixel, sort of sub-millimeter pixel resolution on the sea floor. And we're collecting tens of thousands of these with each dive. Here's an example of one of the dives that was completed. This is an area of almost 8,000 square meters. So about 150 meters along this long axis, about 50 meters wide, and goes from about 5 meters of water depth down to around 75. So this is about twice the size of a football pitch, just to give you kind of a sense of the scale of the model that we're generating. And this is what it looks like in 3D. These kind of individual coral sitting up on top of these rocky boulder fields. I think this is still a pretty unique capability that we have at this lab, being able to kind of generate models of this kind of scale. All right, and then just a couple of weeks ago, we were invited by the Australian Museum to head out to Norfolk Island to help characterize reefs around both Norfolk and Phillip Island. They had done some LiDAR images. They used lasers to measure the seafloor structure. We'd kind of put together some plans, thinking, ideally where would we like to have the AVs deployed. So we were kind of targeting different reefs around the island, or the islands. And in the end, we spent, I think, 4 days. We had a weather window of approximately 4 days where we could actually operate. The sea was about 4.5 meters swell, like 2 days before we arrived. It calmed down on the day we kind of landed. And then when we were leaving, the swell picked up again. But we managed to do, I think, 14 dives all around Norfolk. We didn't get up onto the north or the east because the predominant swell was coming down in that direction and the wind was pretty strong throughout the deployments. We also deployed the vehicle in this area, which is actually the wreck site of the HMS SIRIS. So one of the first fleet ships was wrecked at Norfolk Island. We were given the coordinates of the site. We put a map together. We drove in a small boat right into the nearshore environment, and there was guys surfing on the wreck. And we thought, yeah, maybe we won't put the vehicle in there just because the swell was pretty huge. So we did some surveys just offshore of that to see whether there maybe were any artifacts that had washed off the site. And these are just some so these are images. We strapped a GoPro onto the vehicle. So we're taking images of the sea floor, but this gives you kind of a picture of what's happening around the platform. And if you look carefully, there's a few sharks up here that are kind of cruising around. So some nice looking reef, and we're still working through the data. So that was a couple of weeks ago. We're up there collecting this, running these vehicles over this quite complex topography. So that's kind of, yeah, we can deploy vehicles on reef slopes. What if we go into deeper water? So we've done a bunch of work, and not a lot of this is more historical. We haven't done much in the deep water recently, but I think I'm going to talk about two projects in particular. One was some work on mapping artificial hydrothermal vent sites in Japan. So here what we were doing is deploying two imaging systems. One was developed by a colleague at the University of Tokyo. So this is a camera that can be used from 8 meters of altitude. So it's a thermally cooled imaging system, so it can collect imagery in very low light conditions. And then we had our own imaging system, which we were deploying at 2 meters altitude. And you can see, some of these these are, I think, lobsters and crabs and shrimp and various mollusks and things that grow around these vent sites. So essentially, this is a drill guide that's been placed in 1,000 meters of water. They then put this drill down from the surface to drill into the sea floor to access hydrothermally heated water that's trapped under the crust. And then when they drill into that, the sort of warm mineral-rich water comes up. Premise is that is quite mineral-rich, and that possibly maybe like a lot of hydrothermal vent sites have quite high concentrations of precious metals and rare earths and things like that. So there's a notion that if you could kind of make these vents happen, then you could mine them. So this was, I think, the objective of those original studies. What we were asked to do was come in and help map some of those sites. So all this white stuff here are bacterial mats, which are essentially feeding on that rich water that's being pulled up through these artificial vent sites. You can see kind of some of the detail of that drill guide. If you look really carefully in some of this, you can see all these little white dots are those lobsters, which are feeding on the shrimp, which are feeding on the mollusks, which are feeding on the bacteria. So there's a whole ecosystem generated around these sort of sites. You can see them quite in high concentrations around that site that they've drilled into. And if we looked at the models, so this is a map that was collected with a camera from 8 meters of altitude. They're able to see some of the bigger species. So these are the big lobsters, I think. I think the blue is the crabs. And then if we look at sort of this smaller area that we've been able to cover with 2 meter altitude camera, you can see a lot more. These are some of the mollusks and things like that. So the things you can see in the imagery depend on the altitude from which you're observing. So the fact that we can operate vehicles very close to the seafloor is important for these kind of studies. Another interesting deep water site that we helped survey. So this is the caldera of the Colombo, or the Colombo caldera, which is offshore of Santorini in Greece. And this goes down to about 600 meters of water depth. There's some hydrothermal venting activity within the caldera. And so again, Jackson was involved in some of this work. the objective here was to try and find new venting sites. And so there was a process of identifying where existing vents had occurred, looking at the characteristics of the bathymetry that corresponded to where those vent systems were, and then identifying a couple prospective new venting sites. And in fact, I'm not sure if this is from the new sites, but on this expedition, they were to find new vent sites and then to use one of the ROVs with soil to collect samples and sort of understand a little bit more about the biology of those environments. I think there was also some gliders being deployed in the caldera. So again, multi-vehicle deployments during this expedition. We go from deep water right up into the coastal zone. We were involved in a project that was funded through a Trusted Autonomous Systems Defense Cooperative Research Center for I think about 4 years, led by Thales, but involving 3 university partners, or actually 4 university partners and a couple of other SMEs. The Seeker vehicle actually came out of this program. There was also a crawler, which was used for collecting imagery and kind of driving around in those kind of nearshore environments. We did some demonstrations of depth gated surveying near shore. So looking at being able to collect imagery in nearshore environments to support combined countermeasures and rapid environmental assessment operations, which are typically used by armies and navies to characterize those nearshore potential landing sites. So if we can collect imagery, but also derive bathymetry from those images. We also did some work. We put a sort of an artificial target into the environment. See, these are little D shackles, so quite high resolution imagery being collected by the vehicles. And then one of the other outcomes of this work was looking at anomaly detection techniques. So thinking about how you can find unusual objects, in a mine countermeasures, kind of the objective is to find the mine-like objects. And so what we did here is we looked at taking the imagery from the survey, again, using one of these variational autoencoders to find a latent space that allows us to reconstruct the images, which essentially gives us features that are characteristic of the environment. Using those features then to reconstruct the imagery. And what we find is that when there's an unusual object that isn't characteristic of the rest of the environment, that stands out as very poorly reconstructed. So the features that allow you to reconstruct the normal environment don't do well on things that aren't normally there. And so you can see these kind of, that acoustic target that would be put in stands out quite clearly as something that's unusual in the environment. So this is completely unsupervised. We don't have to say, look for a particular thing. It's just looking for unusual things. We could also put in some spatial proximity into to help kind of with bringing the space in which we're looking for those unusual objects together. And in fact, I think these dots represent images with target in them. And you can see there's a couple of clusters here of, this would be sand and this would be kelp, for example, and some of the areas where there's stuff that's unusual kind of stand out. We also applied that exactly the same technique to some of the data that was collected by the crawler. And in fact, they'd introduced a little mine-like object into the environment, and that stands out as this kind of cluster of images that has that particular object in it. So, using some modern machine learning techniques to find interesting things within the imagery collected by these vehicles. We've also done some work that was funded originally by DSTG to integrate hyperspectral imaging systems onto underwater vehicles. I don't know if Jay is here. So Jay helped out with some of this work and did some of this through his thesis. So here we were deploying RGB cameras and the hyperspectral, low-cost hyperspectral imaging system. And we're able to use the RGB cameras to do a 3D reconstruction of the environment, model the position of the vehicle, and then project the hyperspectral line scans back into the environment. So this is not RGB data. This is actually hyperspectral data that's been projected back onto the 3D mesh generated by the color cameras. So each of the points in this, in each of these lines each pixel is not just an RGB, it's 1,000 wavelengths which are being measured, which we then sort of put some pseudo color in here, but you can see the structure of this target has been reconstructed quite well in that imagery. And then we were able to do some work on looking at characterizing the lighting characteristics within both tank and out in the field. So, thinking about the hyperspectral reflectance of, in this case, the red tags. So these are quite red, as you expect. And looking at the model, the ground truth versus the actual measurements that we're taking. So we have to account for the characteristics of the water column in order to use some of this hyperspectral data. Other thing that we've been interested in is underwater intervention. So we've done a lot of work on mapping. We've been working closely. So Gideon's been leading a lot of our work through both an ARC linkage grant and through the ARIAM hub with Reach Robotics. So they're developing these small, lightweight underwater manipulators. We've got one which we've deployed in the lab, and one of the former PhD students who's now in Norway was looking at building tools to allow you to optimize essentially the torques that are being applied at the end effector with this combined vehicle and manipulator system. More recently, we've been thinking about how you can combine perception and detailed scene modeling with that with the intervention tasks. So again, Jay and Gideon are doing a lot of work here on looking at modern monocular depth estimation techniques. And I think, did you talk about this last week, Jay? Yeah. So I won't dwell on this, but so essentially we're able to take single images and turn them into estimates of 3D structure. And that can be run online quite quickly. And we're looking at techniques to provide sparse 3D data to essentially scale these estimates of the 3D structure of the environment. And we've applied that both to some online data sets, but also to some of our own work at Lizard Island, which I'm going to talk about. So, a lot of fundamental things that we've been working on. We're also interested in supporting science. So we've been doing work to help characterize changes in the environment. So this is an example where we've deployed a vehicle during the day, collected a data set over a rocky boulder field in Tasmania, come back 12 hours or so later, and you can see that all these little dots, those are all urchins, which were kind of hiding in the crevices. And if you look here, you can see kind of the urchins hanging out in the crevices between the rocks. And then at night they come out and they feed on the algae, and they're actually destroying the kelp forests around Tasmania. So helping understand the change in these environments over short timescales, over much longer timescales. We've been doing work looking at the impacts of coral bleaching. Here we did a survey in 2010. End of 2010, there was a significant bleaching event along the western Australian coast, essentially destroyed all of this plate coral, but you can see there's been significant regrowth of these more branching, fast-growing corals. So understanding the dynamics of these environments, I think the latest surveys we did at this site was in 22, I think. So really excited looking at almost a decade worth of change through time. I'm going to skip through this one. Lizard Island, we were meant to be there in 2014, but a cyclone went straight over the island the week we were meant to be there. So no surveys on that particular week, but a week later, a couple of Oscar and Ari, former PhD student, went up. They surveyed sites all around the island. Lizard was then hit by another cyclone in 2015. We thought we'd have this great story of recovery. Another cyclone hit in 2015, and then 2016 through 18, there was massive bleaching on the Barrier Reef. So there's a very complex kind of story of coral reefs. But essentially what we're doing here is we did bring some AUVs up, did some surveys, but we also had an imaging system that was deployed by divers. So this is a couple of PhD students We've got a pole here. There's a big drum. We run a line around it. We attach that to the camera and essentially just swim, keeping tension on the line. And as the line feeds out, you're basically going out by the diameter or the circumference each time you go around. You do some photogrammetry and you get a very nice estimate of where each image was taken. It takes about 15 minutes to do one of these guys. This covers about 100 or so square meters. And you can see sort of the 3D structure of that reef. And we've then repeated these every year since 2014. And we've just been invited to head back to Blizzard later this year to keep supporting this work. But as I said, there was bleaching through about 2018, but then in 2019, early 21, I think, and then 22, you can see there's been some significant recovery of those reefs. Mentioned Mechatronic earlier, so this was a great trip. We got invited to by Woods Hole and the Effort for Antiquities in Greece to come and survey the site of the Antikythera wreck. So this is a little video of the Antikythera mechanism as they think it looked. So it was used to sort of estimate, phases of the moon and planets and all kinds of stuff, and was discovered on a wreck that's been dated to 83 BC. So we were invited to bring one of our UV systems. We surveyed, this is about 10,000 square meters of sea floor, vehicle kind of cruising back and forth. We can see amphora, this anchor stock, various bits of pottery and things. Do a whole talk on this little shadow here, which is a cliff, which we had kind of an offset between our positioning and the underlying bathymetry. So the first dive on the first mission that we did in Antikythera, the vehicle went down here. We were watching acoustically what was happening, and suddenly the bottom dropped 10 meters below the vehicle. It then did what we told it, which was just drive down to the new bit of seafloor, turned around, started coming back up, ended up on this 11-meter cliff, and then kind of stopped, got caught out actually under some fishing lines. So our first deployment on this trip, we had to pop an ROV in, go and rescue the AV. But then we shifted all of the surveys away from the cliff, and we're able to get some great data. This is what some of those models look like. So here's this anchor stock. So this is a big bit of lead that would have been on the top of the ship's anchor. So here the archaeologists are actually recovering that bit. And we then went back for a second field season, filled in surveys all along that kind of cliff face, and they were able to find artifacts mainly in this site, which was the original Antikythera site, and then they found some other artifacts down here, but we couldn't see anything in any of the kind of intervening areas. So I think this is actually two different wreck sites, and pretty exciting. But they used, so the sort of outlines here are the maps we generated. They were able to then situate some of the artifacts they found, including nearly complete human remains buried under the sediment for 2,000 years. This is a jawbone and some teeth. Pretty interesting kind of science. I'm going to skip through some of this. Machine learning, transforming the way we do. We look at the data. So Heather's sitting at the back, done a lot of work on this domain adaptation. So if you have different vehicles with different sensors and different cameras operating at different altitudes, if you train a machine learning algorithm on one set of data, how do you translate that onto new data sets? Yeah. We also make all this data available. So Squiddle is a system set up by one of the former PhD students, Ari. So we have sort of 10 million images of the sea floor that are currently online from 20 different platforms, 2 of which are ours. tens of thousands of deployments and lots of annotations. So people are actually getting in and using this data to help train machine learning, well, help describe these environments. So there's lots of tools here that you can use to label the data. You can, you put these AI tools to work to kind of do some of the labeling. And in fact, we've just hired a new PhD student on this project. He's going to start in the next couple of weeks. We've got a linkage grant to continue developing machine learning tools for this system. We've also got the capability of putting some of the mosaics underlying this so that you can kind of look at the relationship between those detailed mosaics and the locations of all the imagery, kind of use that as a guide to explore this data. And I think I'm almost done. One other environment we haven't worked in is the polar regions. So there's a lot of work going on around the world in using robotic systems to characterize polar environments. So this looks very much like our SIRIS vehicle. It was also built at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. This is it's Jaguar or Puma, one of their other SIRIS-like vehicles being deployed in Antarctica. This is a picture of some work Gideon was doing with Woods Hole, deploying a glider in ice environments in the Arctic. This was shortly before they ran over a boat, but that's another hazard of deploying robots in these environments. Another way people are collecting data is with sort of more mammalian data collection tools. So they actually strap sensor payloads onto seals and get them diving down to like 2,000 meters and getting under the ice and doing all kinds of interesting things. This is kind of an interesting thing. This is from Rich Camilli at Woods Hole, who we worked with. These are sort of characteristics of AUVs that are used for studying oceanographic environments. And particularly if you're starting to think about Arctic work, you have ranges, you can get out to thousands or tens of thousands of kilometers. So the auto sub have long range vehicles that are capable of 6-month deployments now, 6,000 kilometers of travel. Some of these gliders and smaller AUVs also. And then you look at kind of mass. So expense kind of goes up this axis as well. I think as you start to get up into large vehicles, you're spending lots of money. I gave this talk in Europe, so I put in a European version. And then I'd also put our friendly seal in here. Low cost, low mass, but can go tens of thousands of kilometers collecting interesting data. So I think there's lots of ways you can study the ocean. And I'll just put a shout out. We are looking at, as I mentioned, commercial potential for this. So we've set up a company called Seascape Autonomy to look at the commercial potential of this in environmental survey, offshore wind, and defense applications. So a lot of interest from the university in helping support this. And I think lots of exciting opportunities that we can get involved with. I think that's it. So lots of things that AUVs and robotic systems have done to help understand oceanographic environments. Lots of interesting future things, long range, autonomous marine teams, thinking about autonomous underwater and surface vessels, so optimizing the design for deployments, using machine learning more regularly to really think about processing of this data. And I think one of the things we're really thinking about, motivated in part by that Hawaiian trip, was how do we increase the operational tempo for these operational teams? So bringing a team of 50 people to deploy robots is probably not terribly efficient. How do we start to get towards multiple vehicles being supported by small teams out in these kind of environments? Happy to take a couple questions.
So, 28 years ago,
yeah,
you basically said you guys were going to be looking for manganese nodules and do some underwater mining.
Yeah.
You haven't done it. We
haven't done that, but the colleague that we've worked with at the University of Tokyo, who's now at Southampton, they did do a lot of that. They actually were out surveying for manganese nodules using AUVs and some ROVs. They were actually going out and collecting manganese nodules. We haven't had, nobody's asked to come along to get involved in that kind of work, but yes, I guess as rare earths are becoming more topical, it is still expensive to go out and do that kind of work. Yeah. But yes, there is interest in that. People have looked at using robotics.
Yeah.
But I think on an industrial scale, you start to need very big machines to collect any kind of meaningful quantities of manganese from those cells.
Thank you.
Yeah, Stefan, great tool, thank you. Wondering, are there many groups working with underwater and aerial vehicles simultaneously? So they're connected and working together or not?
Not that I'm aware of.
Right.
There's been a few calls recently through the Defense Innovation Network in using kind of communications from subsurface to aerial. So how do you get data from a sub, for example, onto an aerial platform in a covert way? So there's certainly interest in that kind of data exchange.
Yeah.
And you can use lasers or optical, either optical techniques, possibly acoustics, or have a little float or something. We did put a proposal in to suggest that what you really need is a network of loitering AUVs that can hang around. The sub can then say, hey, here's what I've done, head off, and then have your thing surface at an opportune time once the expensive assets out of the way, and then have a chat for the UAV. So I think there's definitely potential for those kind of joint things. The other interesting work that I've seen, I think Ian actually had a thesis student this year looking at aerial, like transforming vehicles that go from aerial, so they fly and then they dive under the water, and then they can
HUAVs.
and then they can kind of cruise underwater, and some of them can also then relaunch into the air.
There's a paper I've been on with ADFA that they did a study of that.
Yeah.
A CFD study.
Yeah.
Only raised the aerial versus aerial and water, because in terms of climate change, there's clearly some connections between what's going on in water, what's going on in the land, and they're probably connected temporarily.
Yeah.
So it seems to me maybe an area that might gain some interest.
Yeah. There's also kind of a lot of work on really long range surface vehicles. So then you're kind of at that interface directly, and whether you can have surface vessels deploying both aerial and underwater, because one of the big problems with both the underwater and the aerial is the limited endurance. So if you can have something that's on the surface that has solar panels that can kind of stay out almost indefinitely.
Yeah, the solar panel aerial vehicles now offer potentially much longer duration.
Any other questions?
Are there any online? I didn't see any flash up, but. Nope.
One question.
Yeah.
Say when you had 50 groups, whatever.
I think it was 4 or 5 groups, but sort of 50 people.
50 people, 5 platforms. Is there a tendency to build a platform, example, or is everyone working?
I think largely everybody has their own kind of niche platforms. There are some vehicles that are certainly being taken up in large numbers, particularly with navies and stuff. They tend to then buy hundreds of platforms to do kind of what they're doing. In the research community, people tend to still have their own bespoke platforms. There's even differences in the middlewares that people are using. So we use something called LCM, which came with the original vehicle that we bought. It's tended to propagate onto all of our platform. A lot of places are using ROS now as their kind of operating to do all the kind of inter-process communication. Yeah, platforms still tend to be pretty bespoke. I guess the gliders are something there are a couple of glider manufacturers, and they're used certainly all around the world by different groups to study these classes. So yes, you are starting to get some standardization. in the kind of near bottom with a few different platforms.
Are you guys going to be involved in this AUKUS stuff in any way?
Depends what Navy says about our proposal. So as I mentioned, we are looking at commercial potential for the small, lightweight AUVs. So we put in a proposal to the AUKUS Maritime Innovation Challenge. That was all about underwater acoustic communications. Proposal says, well, in order to, and that's mainly focused on very large vehicles. So they've funded companies like Anduril to build $40 million worth of massive AUVs that can run for relatively long range. But our proposal is, well, actually what you need is training systems to train people to run multiple vehicles simultaneously and with all the acoustic constraints. So the proposal is to build half a dozen vehicles for Navy to say, and give them the ability to then experiment with multiple vehicles deployed simultaneously. So yes, I guess it depends on proposal outcomes, but certainly there is a big focus on kind of maritime warfare. I think there's commitment even of new funding potentially coming along in that domain. So yes, I think we're well positioned to provide some support for that.
So sort of a addendum type question. We've seen a proliferation of the use of drones in warfare.
Yeah.
Is there a likelihood that small vehicles like Jessica could be used in the same sort of way for underwater warfare?
Yes, I think you could imagine a scenario where you put a payload on an underwater platform. I know Ukraine's deployed, I think it's surface vessels, sort of cheap surface vessels, which when they got out of Starlink range went nuts because they couldn't operate. But yes, I guess potentially. We haven't been doing anything directly along those lines, but certainly I've had discussions with both Australian and US Navy and Army about the potential for kind of payload delivery with a relatively low cost platform. I think that would probably move outside of the university if we're going to start doing that kind of work.
Yeah, I think probably.
Any other questions? So hopefully that was,
Yeah, actually, I had a question. Thanks for the talk. So, yeah, very question related to one particular situation. Let's imagine on the surface of the sea, there's a bunch of oil.
yeah,
And what can we possibly do? Let's say there's that's an accident.
I think,
In place.
Yeah.
So, ask like, what can we do as a first response?
Yeah.
With underwater or surface kind of things.
Yeah.
Say then, yeah, what can possibly be done? And as time goes, how more does it come?
yeah. So my understanding is a lot of those kind of oil spills, they try to manage it by deploying booms. So they'll actually bring these big kind of inflatable, essentially like a cordon of inflatable, like an inflatable barrier.
Sausages.
Yeah, sort of a sausage that you can then kind of try to contain the oil spill as much as possible. In fact, Matt Johnson Robertson, who was a PhD student here now at Vanderbilt, I think, but he did a postdoc at MIT at their media lab where they actually designed an oil response team of surface vessels to try and address that. And in fact, I had a postdoc here from the Woods Hole MIT joint program in about 2010 when the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened, and they were actually using AUVs with a what was the sensor? They had a sensor that they developed that could essentially detect hydrocarbons, and so they were doing surveys in deeper water to try and look at the plume that was coming out of the wellhead, and they were able to detect, oil. I'm going to say like hundreds of kilometers away. So the oil was really spreading subsurface, and I think that's much more difficult to contain. But even knowing where it is challenging. But they were able to use this kind of chemical sniffers on an AUV to kind of go back and forth and kind of figure out where the oil, essentially where the plume was dispersed. How do you deal with that? Don't know. If it's on the surface, I think there are sort of standard techniques for containing it, and you could imagine, you know, a robotic system being brought together.
Whoever's recording is actually responsible.
Yeah. Yes, that's it. All right. Thanks all.